This video is sponsored by Surfshark, specifically one of my favorite features where they give you an alternative phone number, and using it online is a great way to protect yourself against phishing, spam, even potential data breaches because it keeps your real number private. All you have to do is go to surfshark.com/altcompanyman to get alternative number and 4 extra months of Surfshark. The link is in the description. Verizon is widely recognizable by their black logo with that red check mark that could be seen on the front of thousands of retail stores. I cannot even tell you how often I come across it. Look, I think almost everyone realizes that Verizon is a popular phone company, but I am not so sure most people quite understand the extent of it. Verizon is like a telecommunications giant, one of the biggest in the world, serving customers in over 150 countries, though the company is headquartered in the United States, where almost 150 million people use them as their wireless provider. It makes them the biggest of the big three, placing them ahead of AT&T and T-Mobile. Operating revenue of around $135 billion each year consistently ranks them toward the top of the Fortune 500 list. See, Verizon is unusual in the fact that, believe it or not, it technically started out as a Fortune 500 company. That revenue graph is complete, and that 2001 was its first full year of operations, and by that measure, they were already the 10th largest company in the country. I mean, Verizon has been a part of some of the most valuable mergers and acquisitions ever to occur. So for this video, I want to try to provide a sense of the scale of this company by highlighting some of the deals that first led to its formation, and then some of the deals that helped it grow into the telecommunications giant that it is today. The first significant deal leading to its formation was the 1984 breakup of AT&T. I recommend watching this video I made about it if you want to hear more detail about the situation, but the short version is that in the 1980s, AT&T was literally the biggest company in the world before the US government forced them to split apart. They held on to their manufacturing, research, and long-distance operations, but all of their local telephone operations were divested, and the end result was the country being segmented into 7 different regions, each of them being operated by a newly created telephone company, commonly referred to as Baby Bells. The 2 Baby Bells that are most significant here are NYNEX, which stands for New York New England Exchange, and Bell Atlantic, bordering just below it. Well, the next deal on my list occurred in 1997 when those 2 companies joined together. It was a $26 billion deal, one of the biggest in corporate history, that formed the country's second biggest telephone company behind only AT&T itself, that would be known simply as Bell Atlantic. The same name as before, but now it was almost twice as big, so we can already see how things were starting to come back together in different ways. For the next one, I'm going to move over to something almost completely unrelated at the time, a 1999 deal where a British telecommunications company called Vodafone bought a US-based cellular company called AirTouch, who, by the way, had been formed 5 years earlier when one of the other Baby Bells, Pacific Telesis, spun off its wireless business. This one was a $58 billion deal that formed a new combined company called Vodafone AirTouch, and I promise it is all about to start coming together. In early 2000, Bell Atlantic from that second deal used their cellular operations to form a joint venture with Vodafone AirTouch from that third deal, and that new business was called Verizon Wireless. The name Verizon was created as a combination of the Latin word veritas, meaning truth, and horizon, trying to convey the fact that they were always looking forward. That might be a bit deeper of a meaning than you would expect from the name of a wireless company, but also kind of unique and memorable. Finally, as if all of this was not confusing enough, only a few months later, Bell Atlantic, who is now 55% owner of the newly created Verizon Wireless, merged with an unrelated phone company, mostly from the western part of the country, called GTE, in a deal that was bigger than any of these others. The result of it was a new company called Verizon Communications that already had 28 million customers found throughout most US states. At the time, the president of the company affirmed that from day one, Verizon will be a leader in the communications industry. So that is a complex sequence of events that led to the formation of Verizon as an industry leader, and I promise things are going to be much more straightforward from this point. From there, Verizon continued to grow its customer base, and a big part of it, as you might remember, was this guy. Early on, they started this campaign that ran for almost a decade, where this guy would walk around in all different places testing the reliability of Verizon service by asking over and over,
"Can you hear me now?"
That actor was chosen after considering over 1,000 other people to represent the actual Verizon employees that would travel around testing the network. And those commercials really did help get the public familiar with the Verizon name. For a while, whenever anyone would say Verizon, that is what people would picture. However, that character would later appear in commercials for Sprint, telling the viewers that he switched his phone service because nowadays all the networks are good and Sprint's reliability is now within 1% of Verizon. However, in 2025, he was back in a Verizon commercial with Buzz Aldrin, so if nothing else, I think all of this helps prove how memorable and effective that original campaign was. Since then, Verizon has expanded the business, mainly through various acquisitions, and I mean dozens of them. So for the rest of this video, I would like to highlight 7 of them that I find to be the most interesting. The first one of these taking place in 2005, when Verizon bought MCI. Now, back in 1997, MCI was bought by WorldCom in what was reported as the largest merger in US corporate history. And 2 years later, WorldCom also attempted to buy Sprint for an absurd amount of money. In the early 2000s, WorldCom was at the center of one of the world's most infamous accounting scandals that led to its bankruptcy. Coming out of that bankruptcy, the name WorldCom had a terrible reputation attached to it, so the name of the company was changed to MCI, representing their biggest acquisition from years earlier. 3 years after that, Verizon bought that company. It had shrunk considerably from its peak a few years earlier, but still worth billions of dollars. Next up on the list, in 2008, Verizon bought Alltel, who was the nation's 5th largest wireless carrier at the time, with 13.2 million subscribers. It cost $28 billion, and the addition of those new subscribers was enough to push Verizon past AT&T to become the largest wireless provider in the country. By the way, AT&T had been regrowing in a similar way, reconnecting the baby bells and acquiring competitors, so this was big news when Verizon took over that #1 spot. The next notable acquisition is in fact the biggest one that Verizon has ever been a part of to this day, and you are going to be maybe a little confused when I tell you that in 2013, Verizon acquired Verizon Wireless. Yeah, remember, the wireless operations were created as a joint venture with the British company Vodafone AirTouch, who up until this point owned 45% of it. Here, Verizon Communications, the overall company who owned the other 55%, spent $130 billion to obtain full control of it. Moving on with the list, only a couple of years later, Verizon acquired AOL, America Online, and I have to make it clear that owning AOL in 2015 was not quite the same thing as owning it in 2000, when it was bought by Time Warner for literally 40 times more money. But it was still a $4.4 billion deal that included some recognizable media assets, like TechCrunch, for example, that AOL had bought in 2010, and the Huffington Post that AOL had bought the following year. So now, Verizon was the owner of all of it, and collecting hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising revenue each year. Along those same lines, in 2017, Verizon bought the core internet business of Yahoo for about $4.5 billion. Again, the timing of this deal has to be emphasized because Yahoo had fallen quite a bit compared to a decade earlier when Microsoft offered almost 10 times as much for it. I think you'll agree with me when I say that these deals are starting to form a pattern here, where Verizon takes over big-name companies that are well past their prime. I compare it to the 1999 Houston Rockets. I mean, Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, Scottie Pippen are 3 of the all-time greats, and that team probably would have been unstoppable had it been a few years earlier. In 2020, Verizon sold the Huffington Post to BuzzFeed, and the following year sold the rest of their media group, including AOL and Yahoo, only holding on to 10% ownership of it. Going back to the list, really quick for the last 2, in 2021, Verizon bought the prepaid phone company TracFone Wireless. It was a $6 billion deal, more than they paid for AOL or Yahoo, by the way, and complemented their brand Visible that they had launched a few years earlier, further expanding their wireless operations by adding 20 million new customers. Finally, in 2024, Verizon bought Frontier Communications. I mentioned this one because it was one of the most recent and the most valuable acquisitions. They paid $20 billion for it to strengthen their fiber network by adding 2.2 million fiber subscribers across 25 states. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about Verizon? Is the company in fact larger and more widespread than you realized? And for any customers of theirs, what has been your experience? Do you think they deserve to be the top wireless provider in the country, or have you had a better experience with one of the others. As always, I want to make sure it's clear that neither of my lists are meant to tell the full story here, but rather the highlights that I felt were the most important or the most interesting. Trust me, there are plenty of other deals connected to Verizon that could have been discussed, like in 2016 when they bought Fleetmatics for $2.5 billion, and in 2020 during the pandemic, they bought a video conferencing company called Blue Jeans for $400 million and then shut it down a few years later. Just a few examples there, so tell me if you think something should be added or subtracted from the list. Finally, I also want to draw attention to the fact that I've made videos about so many of the companies that I just briefly mentioned today, and if you watch through them, I think it starts to put together the bigger picture. So please, if you end up doing that, let me know if it's true, and any other thoughts you have about Verizon or anything else in this video, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Surfshark is the sponsor of today's video. It is a VPN that I recommend partially because every plan comes with a feature called Alternative Number, where you are literally given an alternative phone number, and just take a second to think about how often you are putting your phone number out there on the internet. It happens when you are buying something online from an e-commerce platform, when you make reservations at a restaurant, when you sign up on a dating platform, and every time you do it, you are leaving yourself open to potential data breaches, spam phone calls, and scam phone calls. Yeah, voice phishing, or vishing, as I guess it's called, is a real issue. In 2022, Americans lost an estimated $39.5 billion because of it. I think we all realize that it is safer to keep our private numbers as private as possible, so using an alternative number in many cases is a smart way to protect yourself. Simply go to surfshark.com/altcompanyman to try alternative number and 4 extra months of Surfshark. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.